A child's scream is heard, loud enough from the street below, but no one came, no one stepped in. Zymere Parkins, just 6 years old, was trapped in a world he couldn't escape. His cries, full of desperation and terror, went unheard. The people who were supposed to protect him, they failed him. The people who heard his pain, they ignored it. How could a child's cries go unanswered? How could no one step in when the signs were clear? This isn't just about one child. It's a story about a system that turned its back, about people who looked the other way, and about the lives left shattered in silence. June 21st, 2010. Harlem, New York. A baby boy named Zymere Parkins came into the world with a tiny cry, unaware of the storm that would follow him from the start. His mother, Geraldine Parkins, had just graduated from high school. She was barely an adult herself, standing at the edge of life with a newborn in her arms and no real support to hold her steady. Both she and her son tested positive for marijuana at birth. The city's Child Welfare Agency, the Administration for Children's Services, ACS, noted it, but found no immediate reason to intervene. For a short while, the world seemed quiet. Geraldine was living with her grandmother then, the woman who had raised her. The small apartment in Harlem became the boy's first home. For 7 months, he had the comfort of milk, lullabies, and the soft hands of a mother trying to figure out life. He had no father in the picture. Geraldine said she had lost contact with him after the birth, and the absence left her navigating motherhood alone. Then, everything changed. Geraldine's grandmother accused her of something unthinkable, having an affair with her husband. Whether true or not, the accusation shattered what little stability Geraldine had. One night, she was told to leave. She stepped out with her baby in her arms and nowhere to go. The child who had just learned to smile at the sound of his mother's voice was suddenly homeless. The next years were a blur of survival. Geraldine and Zymere drifted from one shelter to another, each one a temporary haven that came with new rules, new faces, and new dangers. Sometimes she slept in corners of crowded rooms, other nights in places that didn't feel safe enough for a young mother and her infant son, turning to prostitution to scrape together a little money. On some nights, she would pretend to have a crack addiction, just so she could stay in facilities meant for addicts, because it was the only way to keep a roof over their heads. Life in the shelters left scars you couldn't always see. Geraldine's life became a pattern of abuse toward Zymere as his life began to take shape. The pressures of homelessness, poverty, and loneliness hardened her heart. One day she struck her toddler with a belt. She explained that she suffered from lupus, a disease that left her weak and in pain, so she sometimes used the belt instead of her hands. Staff at the shelter saw her. They warned her that she could be reported, but nothing serious happened. The warning hung in the air, and the cycle continued. Even in that life of chaos, moments of innocence shone through. Zymere was a small boy with a shy smile and bright, searching eyes. He carried a little backpack that looked too big for his small shoulders, the kind that swayed side to side as he walked. People passed him on the streets of Harlem without a glance. No one could have guessed the story behind those brown eyes, or the fear and love twisted together in the tiny world he knew as home. Everything shifted again in May 2015. That was when Geraldine met Rysheim Smith, a 42-year-old man whose presence would soon consume her life. He was older, louder, and more forceful than anyone she had known. Within months, he had moved into her small apartment. The dynamic was immediate: control and dependence. Geraldine, weary from years of instability, clung to the security he seemed to offer, even as the price of that comfort grew heavy. From the outside, they looked like a family, a mother, a child, and a man providing structure. Inside, the warmth of home was thin, fragile, and constantly at risk of shattering. Zymere was quiet, careful, and watchful. The little boy who should have been free to run and laugh often stayed close to walls or corners, learning to read the mood of the adults around him. Geraldine's love for her son was real, but it was buried under layers of fear, exhaustion, and a growing dependency on Reisheim's approval. The story of this boy is not just about the things that happened to him. It is about hope and neglect, love and fear, choices and consequences. It is about a mother who wanted a way out, and the man who filled that space, and how a city watched small warning signs flicker and fade until it was too late to turn back. Would a young mother turn to a man who might hurt her child? Why? What would you have done if you were in her position? And where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Zymere Parkins was just 5 years old. He had the wide, curious eyes of a boy who wanted to believe the world was safe, even when it wasn't. His small frame carried both the energy of childhood and the quiet burden of a life spent moving from shelter to shelter. He had learned early that home could change with a bus ride or a knock on the door. For a child like Zymere, routine was a luxury, and safety was a promise too fragile to hold on to. On June 30th, 2015, the first clear warning that something was terribly wrong reached the city's child protection system. That morning, Zymere had done what children do. He picked up a crayon and drew on the wall of the small Harlem apartment where he lived with his mother, Geraldine Parkins, and her boyfriend Smith's response was not the frustration of a tired adult. It was violent. He beat the little boy with a belt, the sharp sound of leather striking skin echoing through the thin walls of the building. The screams were so loud that a neighbor heard them from the sidewalk below. That neighbor, disturbed by the cries of a 5-year-old, called New York City's Administration for Children's Services, ACS, to report the suspected abuse. When ACS arrived, Zymere told investigators that Smith not only hit him with belts, but also forced him into cold showers as punishment. His small voice was enough to break any heart, yet it wasn't enough to change his reality. ACS noted the allegations and, rather than seeking court intervention, offered Geraldine parenting classes. She declined. The case was marked for follow-up, and no immediate action was taken. Zymere returned to that same apartment, and the city turned away. The summer stretched on, and so did the cycle. On August 28, 2015, another call came in, this time from a neighbor who noticed Zymere wandering the street alone. Geraldine and Smith had left the boy unattended in the apartment, and the child, with no sense of where else to go, had simply walked out. He was 5 years old, his small body unprotected in the city streets. The same neighbor confronted the couple when they returned, and a heated argument broke out right in front of Zymere, with shouting and threats that left the child frozen in place. That neighbor reported the altercation to ACS as well, describing both the neglect and the emotional harm the child was enduring. When ACS followed up, they observed visible injuries on Zymere. Bruises traced a story his words couldn't fully tell. Once again, he admitted to investigators that he was being beaten with belts and forced into freezing showers. And once again, the agency made no move to remove him from danger. How many chances does a child get before someone steps in? The red flags were waving in plain sight, and yet the system failed to see them as urgent. Neighbors were calling, reports were stacking up, the little boy's body bore proof. But policy and procedure seemed to outweigh instinct and urgency. The case files noted concerns. The words were clinical. The reality was brutal. For Zymere, every day became a quiet test of endurance. He learned to brace for the sound of footsteps in the hallway, to watch the shift in Smith's face when irritation turned to rage. Geraldine, trapped in her own dependency, ignored the warnings, the offers of help, and the moral weight of what was happening to her child. And here's where the story becomes harder to bear. These weren't isolated moments. They were patterns, unfolding in real time. First the broomstick, then the belt, then the icy water on his small back as he cried. Each report was a chance to save him, but no one truly did. You have to ask yourself, what would you have done if you were that neighbor hearing a child scream through the walls? Would you call again, or would you knock on that door? If ACS came to your home and saw your child with bruises, would you expect them to leave him there? By the end of that summer, Zymere's world was shrinking. The shelters that had once offered a measure of protection were gone. The walls of that Harlem apartment became both his home and his prison. He was just 5 years old, and the adults in his life, his mother, her boyfriend, and even the city agencies meant to protect him, were all failing him. Neighbors, like silent witnesses, watched a tragedy in slow motion. They reported, they hoped, but they could not rescue him. Every call to ACS became a page in a file, and every visit ended the same way. Zymere stayed. And as the summer turned to fall, the alarms kept ringing, unanswered. The little boy's laughter, once so easy to spark, grew quieter. His steps became cautious. He learned to live in fear long before he ever had a chance to feel truly safe. Why didn't social services step in when these alarms sounded? Drop your location in the comments. And tell me, if it were you, and you heard a 5-year-old crying out in that apartment, what would you have done? February 2nd, 2016, 7:32 a.m., Harlem, New York. The winter wind cut through the streets as children shuffled toward PS 123, their backpacks bouncing against their coats. Among them was a boy who walked more slowly than the rest, his thin shoulders curved inward as if trying to disappear into the city. 6-year-old Zymere Parkins held his mother's hand loosely, his lips pressed tight, his eyes low. He didn't speak, but the way he moved told a story no words could capture. When he entered his kindergarten classroom that morning, a teacher noticed immediately that something was wrong. Zymere wasn't just quiet. He was in pain. He cradled his face when he thought no one was looking, and he winced when he tried to sit down. When she knelt beside him, her heart sank. His jaw seemed swollen. His front tooth was missing. The teacher asked what happened, and the little boy hesitated. His voice was barely a whisper. He said he fell. A few hours later, Geraldine Parkins arrived at the school after being called in. Her explanation was different. She claimed Zymere had hurt himself while playing. The stories didn't match, and the unease spread through the teachers like a silent alarm. They had seen children fall before, but this was different. This was a boy whose eyes carried something heavier than childhood clumsiness. By that afternoon, the school contacted the Administration for Children's Services, ACS. Caseworkers arrived to assess the situation. They looked at Zymere's face, the bruising along his jawline, the small gap where his tooth had been. He was 6 years old, barely the size of a child his age should be, and his voice trembled when he spoke. He told them that he had been hit, that he had been punished, that sometimes cold water ran over his skin when he cried too much. But in the world of bureaucracy, suspicion is not always enough. Geraldine stood nearby, calm but defensive, saying she loved her son, that accidents happen, that she was doing her best. Raheem Smith, her boyfriend, wasn't home during the visit, and the apartment smelled faintly of cleaning products, as if the walls themselves had been scrubbed. ACS noted the injuries, but after a brief review, they chose not to remove the child. Instead, they offered parenting services, classes, advice, resources. Geraldine declined. The report would later say, insufficient evidence for removal. Weeks passed, and the cycle continued. April 18, 2016, 8:41 a.m. It was another school morning, but the fear in Zymere's eyes had deepened. This time he arrived with new marks on his arms and faint bruises along his back, visible when he lifted his backpack. His teacher froze. She knew what she was seeing. Her hands trembled as she called the school social worker. They had already filed reports. They had already done what they were supposed to do, and yet, here he was again. The staff contacted ACS and the police, and for a brief moment, it seemed like something would finally happen. Investigators visited the apartment, asking questions, taking notes. They saw the injuries. They listened to Zymere quietly admit that he was hit with belts, that cold showers followed the punishments, that he was often left feeling scared. And yet, the system responded the same way. There was no emergency removal. Geraldine and Raheem stayed in the home, and Zymere was returned to the same walls where the cries were ignored. Teachers would later testify that they felt helpless. They saw the fear in his eyes, the way he clung to his worn little backpack, the way he hesitated before speaking, as if words themselves might betray him. Some neighbors whispered that they had heard the cries, But they had families of their own, jobs to protect, lives that made getting involved feel dangerous. And the system, the one meant to protect him, closed another file. For a 6-year-old child, days are long and nights are longer. Imagine going to bed knowing that the world outside won't hear you, and the world inside your home might hurt you again. His teachers noticed he started to draw houses without doors and stick figures alone in empty rooms. He was trying to speak, but no one could truly hear him. The emotional toll on Zymere was profound, though he could never have explained it in full. He became smaller in presence, quieter in voice, and hesitant even in laughter. A child who once had the simple joy of running, skipping, and showing off his schoolwork was now a shadow moving through hallways. Every mark on his body was a story, and every story was met with a shrug by the very people who could have saved him. The reports were there, the bruises were visible, the cries had been heard, and still, ACS and the police walked away. By the end of April, the warning signs were impossible to deny, but still, no one stepped in, and every day that passed felt like a clock ticking down to something no one wanted to face. Would you have believed the child or the caregiver in that moment? Would you have trusted your instincts over the system's paperwork? If you were the teacher, the neighbor, or the caseworker, what would you have done? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us, because the next part of this story will make you question everything you thought you knew about protection, responsibility, and the price of looking away. By the summer of 2016, Zymere Parkins lived like a prisoner inside the small Harlem apartment on West 135th Street. The walls were streaked with grime and chipped paint, and mold spread in patches where rainwater had once leaked through the ceiling. The floorboards creaked with every step, and in the dim light, cockroaches skittered across the kitchen counter. Some days, the electricity was cut off, leaving only the faint light from the street lamps outside. To a 6-year-old child, this wasn't just a home, it was a cage of fear. Life with Geraldine Parkins and Rysheim Smith had turned into a cycle of punishment and control. Zymere's mornings often began with harsh orders instead of kindness. Smith would shout at him to get up, his voice echoing off the cracked walls. If Zymere hesitated, a belt or a broomstick might follow. Breakfast was not promised. Many mornings the boy watched his mother eat a small meal while he went hungry, waiting for permission that rarely came. The punishments were cruel and relentless. Smith had his own methods to discipline the child. He would force Zymere to do endless push-ups on the hard, splintered floor until the boy's arms trembled and his chest heaved. Sometimes he made him stand for hours in one spot, hands raised, as if frozen in place. If Zymere cried or faltered, cold showers followed. The icy water would hit his thin body, and he would shiver until his lips turned pale. On the worst days, he was denied food for hours, sometimes until the next morning. Neighbors occasionally heard muffled cries through the walls, but no one could see what was happening inside. The apartment door stayed closed, and its peeling paint hid a world of pain. Geraldine sometimes tried to comfort her son after Smith's outbursts, but her fear of the man in her home often overpowered her love. She was trapped between guilt and survival. Her eyes avoided Zymere's when she handed him a towel after those freezing showers, as if looking at him too long would remind her of her failure to protect him. July 4th, 2016, was one of the many days etched in the memories of those few who knew something was wrong. Outside, Harlem streets were alive with the crackle of fireworks, children laughing, and neighbors celebrating the holiday. Inside the apartment, the air was heavy with a different kind of noise: shouts, the thud of small feet hitting the floor, and the sound of something hard striking against skin. Smith accused Zymere of touching his belongings without permission. The boy's explanation didn't matter. That day, he was forced to do push-ups until his arms gave out, then ordered into a cold shower. Later, he was sent to bed without dinner, the scent of food from other apartments drifting under the door as fireworks popped in the night. The punishments blurred into routine. Zymere learned to stay quiet, to anticipate Smith's moods, and to obey every command, but obedience never guaranteed safety. His small frame grew thinner, and the light in his eyes began to fade. The apartment became a world where the sound of footsteps in the hallway made his heart race. Every knock at the door or sudden movement triggered fear. Geraldine's internal struggle was a silent storm. She loved her son, but she relied on Smith for shelter and the illusion of stability. In court testimony later, she would admit to knowing the abuse was constant. Some nights she lay awake, listening to the sound of Zymere shifting on the thin mattress, his small body curling against the wall. She said nothing, did nothing, trapped by fear of losing both the man and the fragile roof over their heads. The environment itself mirrored the neglect and pain. The smell of damp clothing and spoiled food hung in the air. A single fan hummed in the summer heat, barely cutting through the heavy stillness. On days without power, the apartment sank into shadows, broken only by slivers of light sneaking through torn window blinds. In that darkness, Zymere's childhood slipped further away, replaced by silence and obedience. Teachers had already noticed signs of trouble in the months before, but the boy rarely spoke. When asked about his bruises, he mumbled conflicting answers, glancing nervously at his mother. In the apartment, even soft whimpers could bring punishment. Silence became his shield, and that silence allowed the terror to continue unchecked. The daily cycle took its toll. Imagine a 6-year-old facing the kind of exhaustion most adults would struggle to endure. Pushed to the floor, forced into freezing showers, denied warmth, denied comfort, denied the simple joy of feeling safe in his own home. His small hands once held crayons and toy cars. Now they trembled as he tried to steady himself under Smith's commands. By late summer, the terror behind closed doors had become Zymere's normal. His world was measured in hours of punishment, moments of hunger, and rare glimpses of comfort from his mother, who herself seemed broken and scared. Every day in that apartment stole another piece of his childhood, another piece of trust. And as the months passed, the cruelty only tightened its grip. The walls of that Harlem apartment kept their secrets, but the echoes of those nights, the crying, the splashing of cold water, the hollow sound of a belt meeting skin, lingered like a haunting. If you lived next door and you heard a child's cries in the night, would you intervene? Or would you, like so many others, convince yourself it wasn't your place? September 26, 2016, Harlem, New York, 7:42 a.m. The sun rose over the city, casting light on the worn brick buildings of West 135th Street. Inside one of those apartments, the day began with a quiet that didn't feel peaceful. 6-year-old Zymere Parkins was awake, his small body curled on the edge of a thin mattress on the floor. The room smelled faintly of mold and damp clothes, and there was no breakfast waiting for him. His stomach ached with hunger, but hunger was familiar now. Hunger didn't scare him anymore. Geraldine Parkins, his mother, moved around the apartment slowly, her voice low and tense. She was just 26 years old, a young mother who had been drifting through shelters, short-term apartments, and the homes of relatives since Zymere was a baby. That morning, she wasn't at work. She lingered in the kitchen, checking her phone, scrolling silently while her boyfriend, Reisheim Smith, controlled the pace of the morning. By the time the clock edged toward 8 a.m., Zymere's quiet presence seemed to irritate Smith. Witnesses would later say that the smallest things could trigger his anger. Something out of place, a mark on the wall, even silence that lasted too long. On that morning, something sparked it. The apartment came alive with sounds no child should ever hear. The first thud echoed against the walls, then the harsh smack of a broomstick hitting fragile skin. Zymere's small frame took the blows in silence at first, but when the broomstick struck his back, he cried out. His voice carried through the thin walls, out the window, down to the street below. People on the sidewalk might have heard it, just as they had on other days, but no one came up. No one knocked. Reisheim Smith's rage did not slow. He beat Zymere with his fists, then forced the boy to stand against the wall. When Zymere's body trembled and he slid to the floor, Smith yanked him up by his shirt. In a chilling act of cruelty, he hung the boy's shirt collar over the edge of a bedroom door, letting him dangle for moments that felt endless to a child. The shirt choked at his neck and cut into his small shoulders as his feet scrambled for the floor. When he slipped free, the punishment escalated. Smith threw Zymere against the wall, the impact loud and sharp. Geraldine was there. She saw it. She later admitted she was frozen with fear, terrified of losing the man she depended on, trapped in the twisted loyalty she had built with him. She stayed silent, moving in and out of the room, doing nothing to stop the storm of violence. Her son looked at her with confusion and fear, his eyes silently asking for something she did not give. As the morning passed, the apartment returned to silence. Zymere's body lay still on the mattress where he had first woken up. He was 6 years old, a child whose world had been reduced to pain, hunger, and fleeting moments of hope that someone would help him. Hours went by. Geraldine eventually left the apartment. She would later say she walked outside because she couldn't take the tension, because she needed air, or because she thought he would be okay. She left Zymere alone with Smith. By 12:49 p.m., the Harlem streets outside were alive with the noise of the city. Traffic, footsteps, horns. But inside the apartment, the air was heavy with stillness. Smith was in the living room. Zymere was in the bedroom, unmoving. When Geraldine returned and saw him again, she didn't call 911 right away. She waited. She hesitated. She feared what would happen if she told the truth. It wasn't until after 1 p.m. that police and paramedics arrived. A neighbor had alerted authorities that something was wrong, though details remain unclear about the exact call that finally sent first responders to the apartment. Officers entered the building, their footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell, the smell of neglect growing stronger with each step. The front door creaked open, and the scene inside told a story no one wanted to believe. The home was nearly bare. There was no electricity. Cockroaches clung to the walls and scurried across the floor. Food wrappers and old clothes were piled in corners. And in that environment, on the mattress on the floor, they found Zymere. His body was limp, his skin pale. There were bruises across his back, shoulders, and legs. His teeth were clenched slightly, as if he had been bracing for another blow that never came. The officers called for immediate medical support. Paramedics rushed in, assessing him with urgent hands, but the boy was already beyond saving. He was carried out of that apartment and down the narrow stairwell, his body cradled in a way he had not felt in life for a long time. The sounds of the street fell silent as people watched the paramedics pass. The medical examiner would later rule the cause of death as fatal child abuse syndrome, a term that speaks to repeated trauma, to suffering that was never interrupted, to pain that built up until a small body could no longer endure it. And yet, the most haunting part of this day is not only the violence itself. It is the silence that followed, the hours that passed when no one came to help. It is the knowledge that in the heart of one of the busiest cities in the world, a 6-year-old boy spent his last moments in terror, and no one stopped it in time. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the story was as clear as it was unbearable. Zymere Parkins had been beaten with a broomstick and fists, hung by his shirt on a door, and thrown against a wall. His mother had been there, had left, and had returned, but never saved him. Reisheim Smith had ruled the apartment with fear. The neighbors, the teachers, the agencies, so many had seen the signs, but still, he died alone. Now the question lingers for anyone listening, anyone who dares to confront the weight of this story. If you had heard those cries, if you had seen that boy, what would you have done? The days after Zymere Parkins's death in late September 2016 were heavy with grief and rage in Harlem. Police and detectives moved quickly, piecing together the final hours of the 6-year-old boy's life. In the dim, cluttered apartment where he had suffered so much, the air still carried the weight of violence. Broken toys in the corner, his small clothes were scattered across the floor, and near the door, a child-sized shirt, stretched at the collar, silently told investigators how he had been hung in his final hours. Detectives from the NYPD's Child Abuse Squad began their investigation almost immediately after first responders declared the boy unresponsive. They spoke to neighbors, teachers, and the building's superintendent. The same neighbors who had heard his cries now stood in hallways, shaken, replaying every scream they had ever heard. Police discovered the broomstick and belt still in the apartment, streaked with marks and splintered from repeated use. Photographs were taken. Evidence bags were sealed. One detective later said it was one of the worst scenes he had witnessed in his 20-year career. By the next morning, both Geraldine Perkins and her boyfriend, Reisheim Smith, were taken into police custody. Officers had arrived at the apartment just before sunrise, knocking firmly before entering. Smith tried to appear calm but gave inconsistent statements about how Zymere had suddenly collapsed. Geraldine, pale and trembling, clutched her own arms and said little. The police separated them immediately. At the 32nd precinct, Smith was placed in an interrogation room under bright fluorescent lights. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, occasionally shaking his head, refusing to sign an initial statement. Geraldine was questioned in another room, her voice cracking as she alternated between denial and quiet sobs. Within hours, the medical examiner delivered the devastating confirmation. Zymere had died from fatal child abuse syndrome. His body revealed over 30 broken ribs, some fresh, some healing, along with internal injuries and extensive bruising. Detectives returned to confront the adults. Geraldine broke first. She admitted that Smith had beaten her son repeatedly, using a broomstick and his fists, sometimes hanging him by his shirt from a bathroom door, sometimes leaving him on the floor after he had been slammed against a wall. She said she was scared of Smith, trapped in the apartment, and too weak to protect her child. Her words were quiet, but the weight of her guilt filled the room. By the afternoon, both were formally charged. Officers led Smith and Geraldine in handcuffs through the narrow halls of the precinct toward awaiting transport. Outside, the sirens wailed and the media cameras flashed, capturing the faces of a mother and her partner accused of unthinkable crimes. They were placed in separate holding cells at Rikers Island to await trial. Harlem residents who had once seen them walking quietly down the street now watched the images on evening news broadcasts, struggling with anger, disbelief, and grief. The death of Zymere Perkins sent shockwaves far beyond Harlem. By early October 2016, just days after the tragedy, the case had captured the attention of New York City and the entire nation. Headlines screamed of a child failing at every level, and within City Hall, phones would not stop ringing. Parents across the boroughs clutched their children tighter, wondering how a boy so young could slip through every safety net meant to protect him. The public outrage was immediate and unforgiving. Vigils sprang up on the streets of Harlem, where neighbors placed candles and stuffed animals near the apartment building that had been Zymere's final home. Community members wept openly, speaking to reporters about the times they had seen the boy's small frame shuffle down the hallway, and how their warnings felt like whispers in a storm no one cared to hear. In the weeks that followed, city council members demanded answers from the Administration for Children's Services, better known as ACS, whose failures had been laid bare for all to see. Mayor Bill de Blasio called for a state-ordered investigation into ACS and the handling of Zymere's case. The investigation quickly uncovered a chain of missed interventions. Caseworkers who noted abuse but failed to escalate, supervisors who accepted surface-level explanations, and records that revealed 5 separate opportunities where meaningful action could have saved a life. It wasn't long before heads began to roll. Several ACS staff directly connected to Zymere's case were dismissed, and in late 2016, ACS Commissioner Gladys Carrion resigned amid mounting criticism. City Council oversight hearings in 2017 were heated and emotional. Parents, teachers, and activists filled the chamber to capacity, their voices echoing with grief and anger. Council members interrogated ACS leaders about why the agency did not remove Zymere despite repeated red flags. Some staff admitted under oath that workloads were overwhelming. Others cited fear of legal retaliation for unnecessary removals. But the excuses only deepened the outrage. A single photo of Zymere smiling in a kindergarten class, displayed on the big screen behind the council panel, silenced the room for several long seconds. His face became the symbol of a city's collective failure. Activists took to the streets and to social media. Marches wound through Harlem and downtown Manhattan with signs that read, "Protect our children," and "Justice for Zymere." Prominent child welfare advocates demanded sweeping reform, insisting that no child should die because bureaucracy hesitated. The city proposed new measures: stricter protocols for investigating abuse allegations, mandatory follow-ups when children report harm, and reduced caseloads for frontline caseworkers. Governor Andrew Cuomo called the tragedy a wake-up call, and state officials pledged to monitor ACS more closely to ensure accountability. Despite the reforms, grief and frustration lingered. Teachers who had once seen Zymere walk into class with bruises and a forced smile gave emotional statements about the guilt that haunted them. Neighbors who had called ACS multiple times expressed bitterness, saying the system had treated their warnings as background noise. Each testimony painted a picture of a boy surrounded by adults who saw the signs but were powerless to change the outcome. News reports continued to dissect the story for months, and every detail uncovered seemed to tighten the knot of public anger. Internal ACS documents revealed a culture of delay and fear, where saving a job sometimes seemed to matter more than saving a life. Council members promised that no case like Zymere Parkins would ever slip through the cracks again. But for many New Yorkers, the damage was already done. A life was lost, and faith in the system was shaken. Community leaders point to Zymere's case whenever another child's death surfaces in the news. His name has become a rallying cry for accountability, a reminder that a child's safety should never be left to chance or paperwork. And so we are left with a question that refuses to fade, a question every parent, neighbor, and lawmaker must answer. What changes should have happened sooner? The trial did not begin until December 2019, more than 3 years after Zymere's death, and the case had gripped the city. In the interim, public outrage grew, and the failures of the Administration for Children's Services, ACS, were questioned relentlessly. People wanted answers. How could a boy be beaten, starved, and left in pain for months while so many warnings went ignored? Inside the Manhattan courtroom, the trial drew teachers, social workers, and neighbors who had all, in some way, crossed paths with the boy and his suffering. The prosecution built its case brick by brick, displaying photographs of the apartment and presenting the autopsy results. The jury listened in silence as a medical expert described the injuries: more than 30 fractured ribs, a lacerated spleen, and deep bruises on his torso, arms, and back. Many injuries were at different stages of healing, evidence of long-term abuse. Then came the testimony that silenced the courtroom: Geraldine Parkins herself. By this time, she had pleaded guilty to manslaughter, a decision that allowed her to avoid a murder trial in exchange for testifying against Smith. Walking to the stand, she kept her head down, hands clasped tightly in front of her. She admitted that she had failed her son. She told the jury how Smith punished Zymere, forcing him to do push-ups, withholding food, and striking him with whatever was nearby. Her voice wavered when she recounted the day he died. She said she left the apartment for a short time, and when she returned, Smith said Zymere had soiled himself. Then the beatings began. Smith's defense team tried to cast blame back on Geraldine, suggesting she was equally or even primarily responsible, but the prosecution countered with the timeline, the evidence, and Geraldine's raw testimony. They showed the jurors the broomstick and the child-sized shirt. They reminded the court that the boy had been 6 years old, weighing less than 40 pounds at the time of death. They called the neighbors and teachers who had reported his injuries. They showed the jurors photographs that no one in that room would ever forget. The jury deliberated for less than 1 full day. On January 15, 2020, they delivered the verdict. Reisheim Smith was guilty of second-degree murder, manslaughter, and endangering the welfare of a child. He was later sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Geraldine Parkins, who had already pleaded guilty to manslaughter, received 2 to 6 years behind bars. In the courtroom, there were no cheers or applause, only a heavy silence. Some jurors cried as they filed out, and others avoided looking at the defense table entirely. The prosecutors spoke to the press outside, calling the case one of the most heartbreaking in recent memory. They said Zymere's short life and brutal death would remain a lesson about the cost of inaction. Members of the public debated whether justice was truly served. Could any sentence, no matter how long, restore the years stolen from a 6-year-old boy who should have been safe? The trial's conclusion did not erase the image of a small child who had begged for protection in subtle ways, through bruises, absences, and quiet fear. Teachers, neighbors, and social workers carried that weight. The city promised reforms at ACS, but for many the promise felt too late. If you were sitting in that jury box, watching the photos of Zymere's injuries and hearing the testimony of his own mother, would you feel that justice had been served? Or would you leave the courtroom knowing that more should have been done to save him before it was too late? In the years that followed, New York City was forced to confront the uncomfortable truths left in the wake of his short, tragic life. His story had exposed not just the cruelty of the individuals closest to him, but also the cracks in the very institutions designed to protect children like him. After the trial ended in 2020, both of his abusers faced the weight of the law. Reisheim Smith sentenced to 25 years to life, and Geraldine Perkins serving 2 to 6 years after testifying against him. But the sense of justice felt incomplete. Today, Geraldine Perkins remains behind bars, moving through the slow rhythm of prison life. She is a woman whose name will forever be tied to the boy she could not protect, and whose choices will follow her long after her eventual release. Her presence in prison is a quiet echo of the life she might have had, a mother, a caregiver, a protector, but one irrevocably broken by her own failures. Meanwhile, the city had no choice but to change. In the aftermath of Zymere's death, ACS came under intense state oversight. A court-appointed monitor was installed to review their protocols, and investigations were launched into how abuse cases were handled across all 5 boroughs. Multiple ACS employees involved in Zymere's case were fired or faced disciplinary action, and systemic reforms were rolled out. Reduced caseloads for child welfare workers, mandatory follow-ups for abuse allegations, and stricter requirements to escalate cases when children showed repeated signs of harm. Oversight committees were strengthened, and the public was promised that another case like Zymere's would never slip through the cracks again. Yet reforms cannot erase memory. For the teachers who once greeted Zymere with a smile each morning, the memory of his soft voice and quiet compliance lingers like a haunting shadow. Many confessed they still replay the moments when he walked into class with bruises, carrying a story he couldn't bring himself to tell. His neighbors, too, carry the weight of wondering if they could have done more, if calling louder or pushing harder could have saved him. These moral dilemmas are the hardest to bear, because they ask us to confront the limits of our responsibility as a community. Zymere's brief life, though marked by suffering, is remembered now as a call to action. Community vigils continue each year in Harlem, where candles and flowers are placed near the building where he once lived. His face, captured in school photographs with that shy smile, appears on posters during child advocacy marches. For the people who walk past those reminders, he is no longer just a name in a headline. He is a symbol of a child who should have been safe and wasn't. And for the city itself, Zymere's legacy is written in policy and remembrance. The lessons learned from his death are meant to protect the children who come after him, yet the question remains whether those lessons will hold. Every new report of abuse that reaches ACS is a test of whether the system has truly changed, or whether bureaucracy will once again move slower than a child's cries for help. As this story closes, the emotional weight lingers. A boy's laughter, once bouncing through the hallways of a Harlem apartment, is gone. The community mourns, the city reflects, and a mother sits in a prison cell wondering if she will ever forgive herself. And so we leave you with the question that will echo long after the screen fades to black. Could this happen again? And if so, what must we do differently? The courtroom is silent now. The city has moved on, but the echoes of Zymere Perkins' short life linger in every corner of Harlem, in the hallways of child protective offices, and in the memories of those who watched this case unfold. Justice, in the legal sense, was achieved. His abusers were convicted. The system faced scrutiny, but the cost is written in the absence of a child who should still be alive. When a child cries out, and no one listens, what happens next? The answer is carved into the timeline of this story. Missed warnings, systemic failures, hesitation from those who could have acted, and now, a boy's life has become a cautionary tale, a warning for every city, every community, and every parent. But this story is not just about the past. It is a call for vigilance in the present. Every neighbor who hears a sound, every teacher who sees a bruise, every social worker who hesitates to act. Your choices can decide whether a child survives or becomes another headline. Future episodes will explore cases like this one, uncovering more stories where the system was tested, where voices went unheard, and where reforms were put to the ultimate test. If Zymere's story moved you, if it shook you, or if it made you question the world we live in, don't let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe so that these stories are never forgotten, and so that more lives can be saved through awareness and action.